Blessings, good evening. It's Tuesday night and we have some questions have come in, which we'll endeavour to answer. So the first question is, Bhante, the ultimate of practicing Buddhism is to reach Nibbana, or to end the process of rebirth. Can somebody think why we don't live the life the way we want, as no one knows when you are born next birth? Can someone think why we don't live the life the way we want, as no one knows when you're born next birth? So I guess you're saying because Buddhism says there's no creator God or universal being kind of controlling everything, it's up to the individual. And then because we can't prove about rebirth maybe, that you can just do what you want. Well, you do, don't you? Most people spend most of their time doing exactly what they want. And where does it get them? Doing what you want is another way of saying following craving. And the whole point of the Buddhist teachings is that the Buddha pointed out, whenever you do follow craving, it is the cause for clinging, which is the cause for becoming, which is the cause for rebirth. And what follows rebirth or birth is aging, sickness, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair, all the bad stuff. So if you don't want all the bad stuff, don't follow craving. So don't just do what you want. Do what's in line with Dhamma would be better, wouldn't it? So the Buddha said, practice in line with Dhamma. Dhammānupatipata. Dhammānudhammapatipata, sorry. Practice in line with Dhamma. The Noble Eightfold Path, which we just chanted in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, is the way to sort out craving, this troublemaker of craving, clinging, to abandon them. And this will liberate your mind from the causes of suffering, cut off the process of rebirth, as you say, and the mind experiences the unconditioned, the deathless Nibbana. So you do have to be careful, because if you say, well, there's no God who's going to punish you, so you can do what you want. Well, in one sense that's correct. You can do what you want, but where does it get you? You have to look at the fruits, the consequences of your actions. And if you just follow craving, the Buddha pointed out, or I would suggest also, that it might not be the best way to go, because craving is rooted in greed, anger, delusion, and leads to suffering. Of course, in the short term, you might seem to get ahead, get some advantages, get some pleasure, get this, get that, get what you want. So we always quote that. People always quote that, and they say, bad things happen to good people, good things seem to happen to bad people, so you might as well just do what you want. Doesn't matter anyway. Take what you want while you can. Get ahead while you can, in any way that you can. You don't have to care about other people, what they think, what they do. Just go for it. Get as much as you can from this world. And in the short term you may succeed, but I think in the long term it'll catch up with you and bring you back to suffering, disappointment, despair, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair, etc., etc., etc. And we see that every day, even within one lifetime, you can usually see this going on quite clearly, even if you amass massive wealth at the expense of all kinds of people, power, wealth. Sooner or later it comes back on you. If you hurt other people, it comes back on you in the form of resultant karma. And many people who have become powerful, wealthy, and would seem to have got what they wanted and done what they wanted, they also end up with a lot of suffering quite clearly. But really the Buddha is just encouraging you to investigate this for yourself, not just take his word for it, or my word, or anyone else's word, to really look and learn from your experience and see what leads to what. And he pointed out, well, anytime you recognize craving as craving and consciously let it go, your mind is in a better position. It brightens up, it's more peaceful. You're undermining this conditioning process which leads to more birth and more suffering. So if you undermine it a little bit, you have a little bit of freedom, a little bit of peace and happiness. If you keep doing that, well, you'll experience more peace and happiness. If you do it completely, then you reach Nibbana. Sometimes people, they come to the monastery and they said, when I was young, I said, I'm just going to do what I want and go out there and make my fortune and make my mark on the world. And they tried that, and then later on they come back and they say, wow, I'm so tired and it didn't quite get me what I wanted. So be wary of the mind that sort of says, I'm just going to do what I want. Maybe need to modify that a bit with some wisdom, mindfulness and so on. Tenajan, can you please shine a light on this quote by Lumpur Dun Adulo, especially the last one? Thank you. The quote is, no matter how much you think, you won't know. Only when you stop thinking will you know. But still, you have to depend on thinking so as to know. So, Lumpur Dun was a contemporary of our teacher Lumpur Cha, considered to be an enlightened master, an arahant. Actually, somebody the other day who lives in his hometown came to visit, and they still go to his monastery, Wat Burapha, where they have a statue and a chedi with the relics of Lumpur Dun there. Arahants, their bones tend to turn into relics, they crystallize, so they keep them there. And they're old enough to have lived in a time when he was alive, and they were very grateful for that. And it's one thing to remember, if you meet enlightened teachers in your life, you tend not to forget that. And it's such a boost for your practice, for your life, if you can. So anyway, he's famous for many wise sayings such as this: no matter how much you think, you won't know. Only when you stop thinking will you know. But still, you have to depend on thinking so as to know. So Lumpur Dun was a scholar as well as a great meditator. He read the Tripitaka, studied it, was very knowledgeable. So I think one thing he might point out, and certainly he did point out during his life, was the development of what we call panya. Panya means insight into suffering, its causes, and how to abandon suffering. Insight or wisdom, we often say, panya. And the Buddha talked about different depths of panya. There's or you might say the initial stage or initial depth of panya. It's called Suttamaya panya. The wisdom and insight we get from listening or reading the Dhamma. It's So from external sources, teachers, guides, who pass on the teachings to us, because you've got to start somewhere. You've got to get the information from somewhere, what to do. You may not need a lot, but you need something. So it's very important for our own right view and correct thinking, correct view of the world and view of practice to arise. You have to listen to Dhamma or read Dhamma, and the better the quality of the Dhamma, the better for you. But it's not enough on its own for you to go beyond suffering, to go beyond thinking, go beyond attachment. You have to bring it in, we say internalize it, think it through. So this is the thinking part. Remembering, thinking through the Dhamma so you understand it better. And this gives rise to what we call Jintamaya Panya, the correct view of things based on thinking, reflecting. The technical term is yoniso manasikara, wise reflection or reasoned reflection on your experience. You have to base this in mindfulness as well, paying attention and then reflecting wisely on what's going on in your experience. So that partly means thinking things through. This is like this is here because of that, this happens because of that. You're kind of internally explaining things to yourself based on what you've heard and read. Now you're understanding it through your own reflection. But still this is not enough to fully abandon the mental defilements, greed, anger and delusion, which cause our suffering. It will help to modify them, help to modify your behavior, and you start practicing because you're internalizing the Dhamma. So you say, keep precepts, this is good. Practice mindfulness, learn to meditate, this is good. So you start to streamline or condition your speech, your conduct, your mental activity in line with the Dhamma, but you haven't reached the deathless yet. But as you practice based on this Jintamaya Panya, the internalization of the Dhamma, thinking it through, directing your mind in right thought, right aspiration, right attitude, the various parts of the path, the Noble Eightfold Path, start to emerge and come together, like right effort, right mindfulness and right samadhi. And as we know, right samadhi involves four jhanas and one-pointedness, ekakata citta, where you abandon thinking, to put it simply. At least temporarily you get a holiday from all those thoughts which have been bothering you for the last however many years, depending on how old you are. It's like a holiday of the mind, one-pointedness. You put everything down, you're not bothered by external sense contact during this practice and development of one-pointedness. Sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, and then the memories and thoughts based on previous sense contact. You're letting it all go and your mind merges into its object, knowing it's one object, such as the breath, anapanasati, and there's rapture and joy, so there's happiness, contentment, stillness, and you don't need to think about anything because you're just knowing one object in a very pure, very peaceful way. There's many depths to this, what we call levels of jhana. But the essential nature of samadhi is this one-pointedness, one-pointed knowing of the mind in the present moment in an undistracted, steady way. But even that is not yet nibbana, is it? Samadhi is a factor of the path which works together with the other factors to purify your mind from delusion, but it's not nibbana itself. What leads to nibbana is correct knowledge and vision of the way things are. So you use samadhi to develop this correct knowledge and vision of the way things are, sammajñana dassana. And that sometimes involves some thought, because sometimes you need to think about things Why am I attached to this? What is going on? What is this that the mind is involved with? So like, we train a lot of our wisdom and understanding it by contemplating the body, and the relationship between mind and body, and the attachment, the sort of fundamental attachment and identification with the body as me, myself, breaking through that delusion. And that requires one-pointedness, but also directing the mind to investigate, and sometimes that even involves some thought. But also you get to a point where the mind is very still in one-pointed, and it's more just knowing the way things are without having to reason through anymore. You've already done that. And the mind gathers together in samadhi. So this gives rise to what we call bhavana maya panya. Cultivating one-pointedness of mind and then looking and seeing and knowing from experience. And it takes the mind beyond just the normal thinking process to just seeing clearly the way things are. But, as the quote says, but still you have to depend on thinking so as to know. So thinking, or training the thinking part of the mind, the thinking faculty of mind, is part of the path, because we have right view, right thought, right livelihood, right speech, right action, right effort, right mindfulness, right samadhi. We use thought to learn the Dhamma, understand the Dhamma, reflect on the Dhamma, train ourselves to the point where we can let go of thought. And when you let go of thought, your mind is in a very pure state of knowing, unbothered by thought. But then when you pick up thought again, it doesn't bother you. You have to remember, an arahant, an enlightened being, can still think, but they're not bothered or a slave to their thoughts. Their thoughts are a slave to their wisdom, a tool. Thought becomes a tool for one who has trained the mind. They can choose what they think, how much they think. When they direct their mind to something, then they can use thought as a useful tool, a skillful means to help other people, usually, to teach. But they're no longer a slave to thought in the way the average meditator sits there thinking and struggling with their thoughts, and it's very tedious and frustrating, but you have no choice, but you have to train in mindfulness. So you go beyond thought, but the thought, skillful thought that you've trained in your practice, is part of the path that helps you to go beyond thought. So you still need to think and train the thinking process to help you understand Dhamma to the point where you can go beyond it. So if you just sit down there saying, I should have no thoughts in my mind, usually what happens is you become very unhappy, because you can't stop thinking and you start seeing thought as an enemy. And I hate my thoughts, why do I think so much? And you often can suffer a lot because of thinking. What you need to do is train the mind in the other factors of the path to the point where your mindfulness and insight is so clear, so strong, you can see thought as just thought, and you can pick it up and use it or put it down if you don't need to use it. So you gain mastery over the mind. It's one way they describe an arahant as mastery over thought. They no longer are plagued and bothered by all that stuff that we are normally plagued and bothered by. So they have mastery over their mind. It's an amazing skill that frees you from suffering. It's the best skill a human being can develop. But it does take training. And if you experience a mind that has stopped thinking but is still aware, knowing, it's not sleepy, not dull, not hypnotized, fuzzy, is aware but just not thinking, because the mind is just with the awareness itself. Well, it's a very pleasant state. It brightens and energizes the mind amazingly. And then when you look back at the world through your senses, you get a whole new perspective, because you're no longer just stuck in endlessly thinking about things and worrying and all the normal sort of worry and anxiety human beings have. Now you can look at things from a place of stillness, so it gives you a whole new insight. So we say it's like, the clouds parting on like at the moment when you have a full moon, the clouds part, you see the beauty of the moon, or the algae or the moss on the surface of the water parts and you can see everything in the water. It's the clarity of the mind that is experiencing stillness, but then you come back to direct it to know the Dhamma, know the truth of things. So a very beautiful process, but it takes training. Another question. Ajahn, one of Ajahn Phuong's teachings, goodwill and compassion, if they aren't backed up by equanimity, can cause you to suffer. That's why you need the equanimity of jhana to perfect them. Can you please explain what is equanimity of jhana to perfect them? Thank you. So tonight we're quoting another great teacher, Luang Por Phuong, who lived at Wat Dhammasatit, on the same mountain as Luang Por Anand lives, Wat Mapjan. Luang Por Phuong lived just down the road, a few kilometres down the road. You can even see the monastery from Wat Mapjan where I used to live. He's again reputed to be a great meditation master. Died a long time ago now, back in the 80s, if I remember right. And he's just pointing out that these qualities, these four qualities, the Brahma Viharas, or sublime abidings, metta, karuna, mudita, upekkha, or goodwill, compassion, sympathetic joy and equanimity, need to be perfected as meditations. We develop them as attitudes, skillful attitudes in daily life as well, through our speech, our actions, but ultimately they're mental training, meditation, that will bring your mind to the place of ekaggata, one-pointedness, on that object of goodwill, compassion, sympathetic joy or equanimity, one at a time. And the point is, when the mind is one-pointed, or the state of samadhi, one-pointedness, it's not wavering, it's not biased, so it can't be swayed in that one-pointed state by the biases of greed, anger, delusion, love and hate. So metta, say, is purified by the one-pointedness, the equanimity of samadhi. So metta spread, say, in all directions without choosing, without a preference. We call it boundless, apamanya, limitless, without boundaries. So this is one of the amazing things. Usually it's an arahant, but not always. Maybe somebody who's on the way to becoming an Aryapugala, an arahant, may have profound metta, karuna, mudita, upekkha. They develop samadhi and they kind of radiate it. You feel it. But until they are an Aryapugala, they've removed some of the fetters or all of the fetters. Even their metta or their karuna can still be limited in the sense it's still a worldly attainment until insight into the impermanent nature of body and mind, five khandhas, is attained. So this is why it can be used as a basis for insight. One develops, say, jhana, cultivating metta jhana. But then one has to contemplate. Even metta jhana is what we call a sankhara. It's part of the sankhara khandha. It's impermanent, it's a conditioned thing. It's not self. It arises, it ceases. If there's a sense of self forming around that jhana or that state of metta, for example, that's still clinging, that's still leading to birth, suffering. The more obvious reasons you need equanimity and the one-pointedness of samadhi when you're practicing metta or karuna is that it's so easy to be overwhelmed by mental defilements if one hasn't yet completed the path towards nibbana. Then you have metta, but then metta is impermanent, so it can fade and you can fall back into anger. Or you can get tired with your metta and you become despairing as you practice metta, but then your state of metta fades, it's impermanent, and then you may experience some feedback. Maybe you have metta and then somebody still doesn't like you or doesn't appreciate you. You can still have anger arise or despair. And as we know, people practice kindness, compassion all the time. They have a lot of metta, a lot of compassion, but then they can become burnt out, disappointed, disillusioned, aversion in one form or another, even depressed. You try and help the world with lots of very powerful kindness and compassion, but then you can reach a point where you're just so fed up and disillusioned because you help the world and it seems like endless. There's always somebody else who's suffering. So your kindness and compassion can waver because they're still conditioned things. So you also need to cultivate vipassana, insight, panya, seeing the impermanent, selfless, unsatisfactory, selfless nature of even the factors of samadhi, the one-pointedness of metta, karuna, upekkha. They are still to be contemplated as not self. Next one. These questions are for Venerable Lumpur Kalyano. Is there an age limit to request ordination? To request, not really, but whether the teacher, the preceptor gives you ordination, that's a different matter. And also, which are the prerequisites to be accepted as an anagarika and progressively become a samanera and then a bhikkhu? Are there conditions that will prevent someone aspiring to take ordination? If yes, what are they? Yes, according to the Vinaya, the monastic training, monastic discipline, there are limitations, and the ordination process actually involves a process of questioning to see whether the candidate is suitable for ordination. The Buddha brought that into the process because maybe the monastic life is not for everyone, not everyone is prepared. Probably number one obstacle might be age. So to become a novice monk, the Buddha said you have to be old enough to scare crows. So usually that's taken as maybe 7 years old. You're kind of big enough to sort of run a crow and say, "Whoa," and the crow will fly away. So you say, okay, you can ordain. Or maybe a kid is not up to it, they need to wait till they're 10. Or maybe there's a super advanced kid at 4 years old already knows how to scare crows. I'm sure there's a few around in the world. But as a guideline, isn't it? They've got to be able to understand things, receive an instruction, go and scare the crows, and then do it, carry it out, and then you maybe can become a novice monk. But you can't become a fully ordained monk until you've attained 20, until you reach 20 years old. So like Venerable Nipako at Bodhipala Monastery, he applied to become a monk when he was still 18, out of high school. So he trained as anagarika and then as a novice. But because he's so dedicated, he learned the Patimokkha as a novice. And on the day he ordained as a monk at the age of 20, he chanted the Patimokkha. So age is a factor. Upper limit, strictly speaking in the Vinaya, there's not really an upper limit, but you also have to consider the suitability of the candidate, because as we get older, we get weaker and sicker. And maybe somebody who has a lot of ailments and illness, disability, maybe they're not suited to the monastic life, because it can be quite a demanding life. And we're beggars, so if someone needs a lot of an expensive health care maybe, then perhaps they're not suitable as a candidate. But there's a lot of flexibility here. Take it on a case-by-case basis and see, how determined they are, how much faith they are, how much they're able to look after themselves, follow the rules. Obviously, they have to understand what the rules are and how to practice them. So there's a case-by-case approach here, maybe, with illness, physical ailments, mental illness as well. Then there's other practical things like whether they have any pending court cases. And it does happen occasionally somebody jumps bail and tries to ordain as a monk to get away from the police. It has happened before in the history of Buddhism. So you have to ask, are the police after you? Big debts, there's another one. Escape from the debt collector, get into the robes. So you have to check what kind of debts do you have. Are they debts that somebody is expecting you to repay? That debt could fall to the Sangha, couldn't it? And then the Sangha suddenly has to take on your debts. So there's a few questions you ask and consider in the suitability of a candidate. Whether they're willing to train, whether they understand the training, whether their background and sort of life situation allows them to ordain. There's a few things you consider. But anyone can request, and it starts the process of that consideration for their training, and then see how things emerge over time. Another question. Thank you, dear Luang Por, for your kindness and compassion. I am deeply in debt with you for your teachings and invaluable help. Blessings. Thank you very much for sharing the Dhamma. I have been listening to your YouTube videos daily for nearly 2 years and am grateful for the opportunity to become a Buddhist. Very good. What is the difference between the fourth sankhara, in English known as mental formations? You probably mean the fourth kanda, which is called the sankhara kanda. Kanda means group. Sankhara means, like you say, mental formations. So what is the difference between that and the sixth sense consciousness called the mind, which you probably are referring to as citta, consciousness, vijnana, sometimes citta vijnana. There's a few variations. So what is the difference? Well, sankhara, we say mental formations. It's the active part of the mind where you make your karma. Karma, where does karma come from? Well, mental formations. And they can fall, roughly speaking, generally speaking, into two categories: wholesome mental formations and unwholesome mental formations. Good, bad, we often say for convenience. Good karma, bad karma. It begins in the mind as mental formations. Literally, the mind forms a thought, an intention, which may just arise and pass away quite quickly. And so it's a very fleeting thing, but it can be a very repetitive process as well, which builds up momentum and strength, is reinforced, and then often will come out as speech. You form speech in your mind first, verbalization of your thoughts and intentions, and then it will come out maybe as speech and then maybe as action. So there's three ways we make karma: mind, speech, body. But the origin of it is mental formations. The mind is the forerunner. This famous first verse of the Dhammapada. The mind is the leader, mind is the forerunner of everything we do, good and bad. Starts as a thought first, doesn't it? That's why it's so important to get to know your mind. But then, of course, you're also aware that an unwholesome mental thought or a wholesome mental thought can arise in the same mind. So there's the mind, which is more of the kind of neutral place, and then it's about what's arising into it, wholesome or unwholesome. So as you practice focusing down on the mind, getting to know your mind better, you also become aware of the contents of the mind. It's one way you could describe it. So there's the mind, is this quality of just knowing, and then there's the contents of the mind, which are conditioned by karma, by past actions and events. Things will bubble up and then we react and we make more karma. This is all the contents, the activities of the mind, and that's also mixed with and joined with feeling, the tone of your experience, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Perception, how you interpret your experience, how you remember your experience. So these are three of the mental khandhas, and then there's vijnana, it's just straight sense consciousness, knowing, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, touching, and then, as you said, the mind itself. So these are all the five khandhas with the body as the physical part. These are the basis for attachment. We call them the upadana khandhas. When the mind is still conditioned by clinging and ignorance and clinging, we've attached to these five khandhas with a sense of self. So the sankhara khandha, the mental formations, if we're not fully mindful, fully insightful, we'll attach to every thought, every intention as me, mine intention, both good and bad. And that's just a fact of life you have to work with as you're practicing. As we all know, we're practicing to see the lack of self in mental formations, but you have to start from a place where you still have a sense of self. So kind of tricky to begin with, but as you train, then the insight, the wisdom becomes clearer, and maybe one day you get a glimpse of the unconditioned, the asankata Dhamma. It's a bit like, a soap opera, to be continued. When are you going to get a glimpse of the unconditioned? We'll keep practicing. Last question. How to get the balance right between service and formal practice? In particular, when there is a big project, people need help, such as sewing robes. I'm never sure whether to work all evening as I'm needed, day after day, or to keep time for meditation, not just falling asleep on the cushion. Thank you very much. Sounds like this is from a monastic. It's a very monastic kind of question. Well, one attitude I would say is there's always more you can do. There's always more practice you can do, but there's also more service you can do. So best of all would be to kind of marry the two, get them two working together. So any acts of service and compassion that you're doing, or duties, responsibilities, say if you're a monastic, towards the Sangha, things you might have certain chores, jobs, duties you're assigned, and that's how the Vinaya works since the time of the Buddha. We carry them out with mindfulness, with insight, with compassion, the Brahma Viharas, so that it's not anything separate from your practice. It goes together. So in the time of the Buddha, Venerable Mahamoggallana had the greatest psychic powers, so the greatest samadhi, you might say. Amazing skills that he developed, powers of mind, to know the minds of others and see beings in other realms and fly through the air, all kinds of stuff. But he's also in charge of building projects. And that's quite common. I know many monks who've developed great meditative powers and become wise, enlightened beings, but they still do very mundane tasks as well. Because if your mind is well trained, maybe you can do a range of things. So you can organize a building project, or administration, or teach, or sew robes or do many things, as well as training your mind in mindfulness and meditation. And you'll see that part of our life is you need to look after yourself, whether you're a layperson or a monastic. You need to do things. If you're a monastic, you need to clean your kuti or the meditation hall. If you're a layperson, you need to clean your house, maintain your house. You go out to work. Monks, nuns, we go out on bindapat. We interact with the world somewhat. We do certain tasks that still bring us into mixing with the world and doing things, running things, repairing things, sewing robes, cleaning things, whatever. You can't avoid that. But what's happening to your mind as you do those things? Are you mindful? Are you insightful as you do those things? And obviously sometimes we get very attached to acts of service, tasks, duties. So it can become an attachment, a distraction, something you need to contemplate and develop the right attitude and right qualities of mind as you do those things. And sometimes we can overdo it. Sometimes people underdo it and they just give up, like the monk who didn't want to mend his kuti roof, and Luang Por Chah said, why are you living like this with a hole in your roof? Because normally the Vinaya requires us to mend the buildings that we live in. And he said, I'm practicing letting go. Ajahn Chah said, how's that? He said, my letting go is when the rain falls through this hole in the roof down here, then I sit over there and meditate. And when the sun comes from that direction, I sit here so the sun doesn't shine me. And when the sun shines through the hole from that direction, I sit over here to get away from it. Ajahn Chah said, no, this is not letting go. This is letting go of a buffalo. You can still mend a roof and practice letting go. It doesn't mean to say you completely give up on things. You still recognize the correct way to interact with the world, and there may be certain duties and responsibilities you have to do, but you also have to learn how to do it wisely, not overdo things, not get too attached to what duties and chores you may be doing, acts of service. You know your own health, your own level of physical and mental fitness, because some people can take on a lot more than others. So you have to get to know yourself. And of course you want to keep a mind that's focused on the practice and cultivation of the Noble Eightfold Path as you do things. So some people are sitting meditating, saying, I'm meditating, I'm not going to do any work, and their mind is full of kilesa. Or some people are doing acts of service and their mind is full of kilesa. Whatever you're doing, you're practicing the path, noticing whether your mind is caught up in greed, anger and delusion, and abandoning that. So it's a very common thing. Monastics, they sometimes are very purist and idealistic. And they say, I shouldn't do anything to do with the world, nothing to do with technology, or nothing to do with building, repairing, cleaning, whatever. I'm just going to be pure and sit and walk meditation. And there may be times for that, what you might call retreat time or time of seclusion. There's certainly a place for that. But you always have to look at what's going on in your mind, and maybe you need to do a bit of service to bring up some more skillful thinking and skillful habits as well sometimes. Famous story at Wat Pah Ajahn Chah's monastery. There's two monks looking at Luang Por Liam, who visited us last month. He was up on the roof of a new meditation hall. He was overseeing the building of it, and he was quietly moving around on the roof, checking the welding of the roof frame. This is maybe 25 years ago, 30 years ago. This is 30 years ago. So he's already a well-practiced monk, very good samadhi, very pure mind, peaceful mind. But he was doing a service for the Sangha, and he's somebody who does a lot of service for the Sangha. But he keeps his practice going, so he's a very good example. Doesn't get distracted, doesn't get angry, caught up in it all, just does it mindfully. And these two monks were commenting looking up at Luang Por Liam, and they're saying, "Wow, he does so much work, never has any time to meditate." And there was another monk next to them who can read minds because his meditation is very good. And he's looking at these two monks who were not very peaceful, and they're full of opinions and a little bit conceited, you might say, which is normal when you're a young monk. You still have your conceit, your wrong views, your attachments. And he said, "Do you know this monk up there, Luang Por Liam, who's moving around on the roof, working, serving the Sangha, doing a good thing for the Sangha, is free from the hindrances as he does it. He's in samadhi. I'm not sure you are." Talking to the two monks who were just, expressing their opinions, not meditating, just talking a lot. Which is a very common sort of thing. When you're new to the practice, you have all your ideals, and you think, it's like this, it should be like that. But often you're not watching your mind very well. You're still full of all kinds of stuff. A lot of thinking, worrying, conceit, anger, etc. And maybe somebody who's learned, they've trained their mind, like Mahamoggallana or Luang Por Liam or someone, they've trained their mind, they can still do a lot for other people, service, but they don't lose their mindfulness as they do it. They can teach, they can do all sorts of things. So this is a training, and you have to get to know what you need to do, and sometimes we need to do more retreat, sometimes more service, or sometimes together. There's no one answer here, but number one is your priority is look after your mind, keep it wholesome, keep it on the path. Don't create suffering out of things. Or even Ajahn Chah, if you read his biography, his teacher, Luang Por Ginari, he was considered to be enlightened. He walked all the way to India and back, barefoot from Thailand. Took 10 years, encountered all kinds of difficulties. But he's an arahant, so he wasn't fazed or suffering with it. Then he came back and he settled down in a little monastery, which is still there today. You can visit. It's very poor, quiet, simple little monastery. And Ajahn Chah went to live and study with him because he found him a very excellent teacher. But when he first was there, he had a doubt. He'd see Luang Por Ginari walk meditation, maybe once or twice up and down his walking path, and then he'd stop and he'd go and sew some robes or sweep some leaves or do some more kind of ordinary activity. And he started to doubt. He's thinking, Luang Por Ginari, he walks a few paces and then he goes off and sweeps the leaves or sews his robes. He's always patching his robes. He's a very frugal monk, didn't ask anybody for anything, lived very simply, lived in poverty. And he's always kind of pottering about the monastery, doing this, doing that. So Luang Por Chah hardly ever saw him do walking meditation or sitting. So he started to doubt. Because Luang Por Ginari's mind is so refined, he knows what Luang Por Chah is thinking. So, he came over one day to Luang Por Chah and said, well, maybe the teacher does only just walk meditation a few paces and then goes off and does another job. But maybe his mind is completely mindful as he does that, and it doesn't really matter, it doesn't affect his practice. And of course Ajahn Chah was a bit embarrassed because Luang Por Ginari, no one had told him what Ajahn Chah was thinking. He just knew what he was thinking, which means his mind was so refined, he knew what Ajahn Chah was thinking. So, you have to consider this for yourself. How much do you need to do? Meditation, work, service, helping the community. It's all good, but how much you consider what's supportive of your practice, and you'll find it may vary. Sometimes you do more service, sometimes more formal meditation. And that's all right. There's probably no one answer to this question, but that's my answer for today. So I'll leave it there.